Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for another one of those tutorials that I do from my home office. But today we're going to be talking about what I consider to be one of the most important things aside from the actual mixing and recording in terms of professional audio, which is exports, otherwise known as bounces or renders. You know, there's several names for it, but in my mindset, they're all essentially the same thing, and that is getting what you've made out into a file. So today we're going to talk about not just exporting, because it is relatively simple to export something, but how you can use some of the more powerful features of Reaper to export not just a file, but how to export multiple stems of multiple tracks, how to export loads of different sections of a project all in one big go, how to have it automatically name every file for you, how to do all sorts of clever stuff with picking renders so that you can just hit go at the end and you can go off and make a coffee and come back and it's all done. So here we go. Okay, so we have a project in front of us. I've just pulled up, for argument's sake, I've pulled up the theme tune to the channel. So let's say that's done, and it's time to get an export of this. So this project was done at 48 kilohertz 24-bit. So the first thing I will do is I will left click and drag a time selection. So this is from just before the start of the song to the end. So I'm going to listen for that delay. That's where it ends, so that's the end of the song. So if I hit save as a routine, I always hit save. Then if we go to file and render, that is where this box comes up, and you can see this has a lot more controls and a lot more options than rival DAWs. There is a lot going on here. This window used to be a lot smaller, but over the years Reaper have added new features as they've been requested. So let's go through them now. This is going to seem a little simple to a lot of you, but trust me, it's going to get more complicated and more powerful quickly. So the directory is the folder that your file or files, multiple, are going to go in. So you can either browse and it'll bring back a lot of your most recents in there. You can browse for a directory in there. It also brings up the folder that you've been working in with this project in here, so you can just click that, and that is a very quick way of doing things. The file name, let's just call this Steve for some reason. But this is where this gets clever. If I make a space, Reaper has a system called the wildcard system. So if I click this wildcards button, this gives me a massive list of things that I can add into the name that will automatically generate when I hit render, which might seem a bit silly at first, but as we get into this, you'll see how powerful this is. So you can add in what the track you're exporting's name is to the file, what the track number is, regions we're about to get into, start and end times. Start and end, because this is a time selection. Let's just go back a little second. Where it says bounds at the top, we can choose to render the entire project, which will be right from the very start, 0, all the way to where there's no more audio or MIDI. Or we can export the time selection, which is what I've chosen, which is that light patch that we selected there. Or there's project regions. And project regions we will come to. They came in Reaper 4, and they've been really helpful for me on certain types of projects. So I'll come back to that. So the time selections, so that will automatically, if you look where it says render to just below it, this isn't a field you can write in, but this tells you what the file name is actually going to look like. So if I get rid of these, every wildcard is dollar something. So the dollar sign then part of the name. So if I put, say, sample rate, if we then decide, because the next part below is where we choose the sample rate, it seems to be picking the sample rate of the project rather than the sample rate we're about to export to, which is interesting. I've never actually used the sample rate wildcard. I tend to keep it simple, but you can add dates in here as well. So if we just added in, is the one that's just date? Because there's year, month, day, hour, minute. I won't go into seconds. Dash. So I've just named this so that automatically that's now going to give me the date backwards and then the time in 24-hour format in that name. Now what happens now is if I hit render and make that into a file, that's going to happen. So let's do that now, and then we'll come back to all these details in a second. We'll keep coming back to this window over and over. So if I hit render file, this is now going to show me the WAV file as it exports. I get to see my volumes, how quickly it's going to finish, what format we're in, and the name of this file. And there's an automatically close when finished, which I put over to so that it gets rid of the screen again. But you can see what the waveform is looking like, you can see what the file name is, and this is all happening faster than real time, which is I'll let it finish because it's nearly done. So it says 1625 up there as the time. If I now go to File and Render again, that's changed to 1626. So what I could do is I could leave the time and date in the name, and if I just keep exporting this out as I make, say, mix changes, instead of calling it version 1, version 2, version 3, and completely getting lost in terms of where I was up to, that will then put in the name as I have told it to, what the date and time was that that mix was made. So even like months down the line, I can just look at that and go, on that day at that time, that's the mix that I made. And there was a half an hour gap between this one and that one, and so on and so forth, and it takes the guesswork out of it. So on to the next set. So sample rate is fairly obvious. You are picking the sample rate at which the file is going to go out. Now, and channels is mono, stereo, or if it's multi-channel. The 48K that's picked here, this project was done at 48 kilohertz. If we decided, let's just save change and close this for a second. If we go to File and Project Settings, we can define a project sample rate. Now that seems really backwards because with a lot of DAWs, you have to tell it what the sample rate's going to be before you begin. But that's where Reaper's quite clever. If I was to change the sample rate that my audio interface or the project we're running at right now, in most DAWs, suddenly everything would start playing faster or slower. In Reaper, that is not the case. Every file is automatically resampled on the fly. Now, if I say this is a 48 kilohertz project, then that's exactly what it was. If I then change this project to be 44 and hit OK, I think I'm going to have to define my audio interface to because I force my audio interface with request sample rate. That way I know it's going to work. But right, so this was a 48K project. All I've done is change things to 44.1. You see these little blue I has come up here, and that's telling me this is being resampled live from 48 kilohertz, as is every other file. If you make them big enough so you can see it, that goes when they get shrunk down so it doesn't take up all the screen. But now everything will run at 44K. Now let's move that back to 48 because that's what we actually want this project to be running at. Let's just check and make sure that this audio's gone to XSplit. I'm going to cut, we'll be back in a second. Okay, just had to be sure there. So I've gone into project settings and forced the project sample rate and said the project is at this sample rate. Now if we go back to that render window that we keep coming to, this little tick box is now available. Now what this does, the use project sample rate for mixing and FX synth processing, is this determines where in your signal chain resampling will happen if you pick a sample rate other than what the project was recorded at. Now, some people are big on resampling and where it happens, so this is for you guys. That say you've been recording all this time at 48k, and the mastering engineer, I don't know, wants a 44.1 kilohertz version, or say you are the mastering engineer and you want to export this at 44k. If I untick use project sample rate, that will export this with all the effects and all the engine running at 44.1 and will resample each audio file on the fly as you go. If you do it the other way around with this box ticked, the project will run at the 48 kilohertz that we told it and we intended it to, and after the audio has been output, Reaper will then convert that output file down to the 44.1. So it's a different way of doing it. It depends, for me, on how many audio files and how many things are going on. If I was working on, say, an electronica track where everything was VST instruments and everything was being generated, I would probably have this unticked and have all the sampling engines run at the sample rate that the export is going at. But if I'm running on a project that's, say, an orchestra recording or something, then I would definitely do it the other way around and make sure that the export was at the same sample rate as all the audio files. And then afterwards, if I needed to do any resampling, which sometimes you do, that would be afterwards. So related to that is the resample mode if needed. I always select extreme high quality because with processing power being the way it is, it doesn't take much longer. It takes maybe an extra couple of seconds per export for the quality to be apparently measurably better. Next it says full speed offline. Now what you can do, an offline render is where it just throws the audio out as fast as it can put it together. Great, which is why when we did that export earlier, you could see it said 1.3 times real time, or whatever that was, and that speeds up your renders. Now 1 times offline makes it go at exactly real time. Then there's an online render. An online render is like kind of the bounce mode in Pro Tools with the where it actually plays all the audio through the interface. If you're having problems with offline renders, this is a good way to make sure that everything's going to work right. An online render can, if you've got things like, I don't know, MIDI triggered keyboards or any real hardware being used with the converters and everything in real time, you have to do it as an online render. And that way you will get the audio going through whatever it is. So there's also idle offline renders, which I'm guessing just puts the priority of the render down. So if you've got other things going on the same computer, it doesn't hog the whole processor. I'm guessing that'll be quite useful if you've got like hours worth of audio to render and you need to do other things with the computer. You could make it idle, and then as soon as whatever else you're working on, you're pausing and there's available processor space, it will take that up and do the render. So the output formats, there are quite a few in here now. So Wave and AIFF, in my opinion, are identical because they contain PCM audio. I mean, if we're getting into floating point audio, that's a different thing, yes, where the AIFF format doesn't support floating point audio. But generally speaking, these are the same to me. An audio CD image is 44 kilohertz 16-bit wave files packed into a CD image format automatically. A DDP image is for sending to a mastering house, which is quite interesting. FLAC is lossless output, which is great for websites like hdtracks.com, where the files are smaller than wave files, but can be 16 or 24-bit. And because they are lossless, then there's absolutely no loss in audio at all mathematically. Let's see. So we've got MP3, good old MP3 for sending your files out to, a client via an email or whatever. Ogg Vorbis is a nice, cheap, free version. There's Wavepack, which I've not seen many people use, but it's smaller than WAV files. In my opinion, you may as well use FLAC because it's a lot more widespread. And then there's video. If you've imported a video into Reaper and you're syncing the audio to it, you can export to a video. It's not something I do, but the option's there. Oh, there's a WebM option. That could be quite useful for making WebM video for internet output. But maybe I'll look at that another time. That's something that I need to investigate. So, that lot pretty much covers general exports. Now, let's move on to stems. So, say you've recorded a song and you want someone else to do the mixing. You've been using Reaper. They may or may not be using Reaper, which is fine in 2017 and beyond. That's now quite a common thing. I get sent audio files all the time that are not in the DAW that I was using. As long as they're the right format, that's absolutely fine. So let's go back to the render window. Now, if we want to export stems, the first thing we do is we look at the top left where the source is. It says master mix. Now, if we change that, the next one down is stems. Selected tracks. Now, the bounds is still the time selection for now because that's convenient for us. So let's say we wanted to export this drum kit and all the separate guitars separately. So what we do now, let's just change the name. So what we do is we select, either using Control or Command or Shift, whatever it is on your platform, to select each separate file. So I can go guitar left. So as you can see here, I've selected for this particular project, kick, snare, hats, rat tom, overheads, ambient mics, the 2 bass amps, and the 2 guitars. So I've selected 10 there. Now if we look back at the render window, it says 10 files. Now if I click on the 10 files button, that'll be grayed out, but it'll show me what they're all going to be called. Now that naming system is terrible. That's just 001, 002, 003. That's not acceptable, but that's where the wildcard system comes in. I can now choose to name these as I please. Now this is brilliant. So if I call this Adam Theme Tunes Stems, then add in the wildcard track number, then track name, or just track. Now that says Adam Theme Tune Stems 03 kick in. If we look down here, that is channel 3 is the kick in. It's called kick in because originally I was working with the microphone inside the kick, the one out. I just ended up multing them all to one track. So that's, but if I click on this 10 files again, it tells us what they're going to be called, and they're all going to be called 03 kick in, 04 snare, 6 hats, tom, overheads, ambience, and so on. So that suddenly means that if I hit render on this, it will give me a separate file for each one of those, and then names will be these, and it will do them all at once. It won't do 10 sets of exports. It'll do this all in one go. So if I hit render, you can see this is a much more complicated set of outputs. Oh, no, that's going out at 44K. We wanted 48K. These are the kind of things you should be checking. Oh, and there's a nice little extra button here, tracks only with mono media to mono files. That'll save you a lot of space, because say if I'm exporting these guitars or these bass tracks that have only got a mono input, instead of doing it as a stereo file, which is really quite annoying, it instantly does those as mono files, but it'll leave things like the overheads as stereo. So if I hit that, and then because I already started exporting them, it's asking me, do I want to overwrite these? So I can either increment the file names, which in this case I don't want to do. I made a mistake, so I specifically want to overwrite them. It gives me a choice there. If I want to call them the same thing but -01 or whatever, I can just do that. So if I hit overwrite, you see the guitar left and right have come out there. Oh, and so's that bass. And a lot of these have come out stereo, but that's kind of my fault for using virtual instruments. Like I think I'm using Stephen Slate drums here, and they're all sent out on stereo buses. If I was sending them out as mono buses, they would be mono output files, and if I was working with a real drum kit, they would all come out as mono, apart from, say, the overheads and the room mics, which I would have on stereo tracks. So that would save a lot of file size sending that to a mix engineer, so they would be much more happy. Now, the next thing is, what about if they then go, okay, that's great, but can you send me all those without the effects on? So there's two ways of doing this. If you look, all the green effects lights here, just above them is a little standby, and while we've got all these selected, if I just hit the standby button, that turns off, or at least bypasses, all of those effects. So now we will just hear completely raw audio. In an unusual turn of events, I actually had the guitars there with going through a bus which had the amps on, which is quite unlike me. But there you go. So if we select these again, bass, overheads, rack toms, and hit play, you'll hear so they're all the completely raw, unprocessed sounds, and they're not going through the master output. So even if I have any sort of two-bus processing, if I export the stems, they don't go through that. So they then don't get mutated and mutilated. So that mixing engineers would be very happy with that. So all you would do then is go to File, Render, while the effects are off, and maybe just add in, I don't know, just no effects at the end or something, whatever your naming system may be. Okay, and that would be nice and simple. Let's turn all these effects back on. So now for the next part, and this is where it gets clever. This is regions. Say, for whatever reason, you've been working on several tracks in the same project. This is something I do a lot with, say, a punk band, for instance, where their ethos is everything should be consistent, everything should sound similar. So let's record it all in one big project. I have the option then to split it out to several projects, but what if I don't? What if I want to do it like this? There's then a quick way to do all the exports and all the messing about so that everything gets exported exactly as we want it every time repeatably, which if you start getting mix recalls and mix recalls and mix recalls, it will save you minutes, hours, days. And then, so we'll look at regions, then we'll look at the region render matrix, then we'll look at the render queue, and this is where it starts to really get clever. So once you made a time selection, so if we were making an album that had 10 tracks, we'd make 10 regions. In this case, all I've got is the main theme tune and a bit of a rough writing kind of session thing from when I was making the riff up, and that's just a bass part. So if I select this and then right click and go create region from selection, I usually use the shortcut on the keyboard Shift R. So let's do that for the other one. Let's Shift R. That's made me a region. If I want, I can then edit these regions to give them a name. So if I call this main theme, and I call this writing, you can see how that's now come up at the top. So if we zoom out and we were to look at an entire album, we could then see what each region was called. It's more powerful than using markers because this has definable end points and start points, and if I double click on a region bar, that then time selects that region. Why is that useful? With the loop button on, I can then loop a region. So what you could do if you were writing a track, you could create regions for sections and then just double click those to loop them later on. And maybe you could even then start exporting sections just to send a section to somebody rather than the entire thing. Just an idea, it's entirely up to you. You're the creative guys, you do what you do. So now, if we were to select all these, again, guitar left, guitar right. Now, if we go back to the export, the render window, where it says source, there's master mix stems. Let's choose master mix and stems, because that is just exactly what it says. It's all the stems we've selected and a copy of the master. So where it says 12, oh, it's 12 files because I also selected one more channel. So 11 files. So that's now got track 00, which is the master output, and all the stems coming out. And if we change bounds from time selection to project regions, suddenly that says 22 files. Now, again, they're not named very well. Some of them have got horrible -001s on, because what we've not done is tell it what the region's called. So if we add in some more wildcards, actually let's add the wildcards after the Adam theme tune. So let's add $region. Oh, let's add $region number before that. So that's it's called Adam theme tune, whatever the region number is, name of the region, number of the track, and what the track's called. So if we look at the 22 files, let's move that over where you can see it. So you can see now that's going to export every stem for the main theme and every stem for the writing session, including the master output. I hit one button for go, and that's going to then export one region, then export the next region. Thank you very much. See you later. That's already going to save me a lot of time. Because let's say that took 3 minutes to export per track, and I've got 10 tracks. That's going to take half an hour, and I don't need to come back to it every 3 minutes. I can go make a coffee, make a phone call, send some emails, come back, and it's then all done. So if I was to hit render, that would start doing the 11 tracks. But here's the next interesting thing. This track on the left here, this track on the left, let's take away the mixer, only has bass parts. It doesn't have any of the guitars, any of the drums. So we're wasting files, wasting file space, possibly confusing a mix engineer if we send him 50 channels and 20 of them are empty. So that's where the region render matrix comes in. So we've made our regions, we know what all our tracks are. Now let's go and view the region render matrix. So the region render matrix looks relatively simple right now. If we were to make a ton more regions, suddenly that would start to look quite complicated. The most regions I think I've ever used was something like 36 when I was doing a big voiceover session, and we needed, say, different chapters. But for an album, I tend to have as many regions as there are tracks on the album. So in this case, let's just say there's 2, because 2 is nice and simple. Now there's a button to render for a particular region all the tracks. It's nice and quick. And there's also a button to render the master. So let's say we do want the master for both these tracks. I don't need the ones called drum recording, bass group, guitar, bus. So I don't need the reverb channels, but if I did, they were there. So for the writing one, that's only got things on the bass and the Sans amp. Oh, and also the bass diesel, is that got audio on it? Yeah. So that is every channel I've selected that I want the audio files from. If I had hundreds of regions here, I could just, click the all tracks button for them all and then just untick the ones I don't need. And that way, if I have to come back to this and make mix recalls and EQ tweaks and change things, I can then at the end just render out the region render matrix again, and every change that I've made is saved in every file without me then having to go through and do all this all over again. That's when this becomes really powerful. So if I go now to render and change master mix and stems to region render matrix, that's gone down from 22 files to just 18 files, because all those files are there for that main theme, but for the writing one that we called it, it's just got those bass tracks and the master, because they're the only tracks that exist. Why do I need to have a load of blank files? And that's saving me absolutely tons of confusion with mixing engineers, tons of time. Now, this is, again, one more powerful thing. So we're not quite done. Yeah, so there was a shortcut here in the region. There's region manager, which says you can choose the region manager. You can go in and you can just tick which ones you want. You can just do them, but I prefer the matrix, the region matrix, because I can see a grid of what tracks I need and what tracks I don't need. Now, the render queue, this is intensely powerful. So let's say, for instance, you went the other way. Instead of having all your files instead of having all your songs in one project like I've done here, let's say that you've got 10 or 12 projects for 10 or 12 songs. So you want to export the master mix and all the stems for all of these. That's going to take all night, right? Wrong. Again, the render queue at the bottom. So what you can do is you can set everything up so that I've made this as I need it. So this is coming out at 44 kilohertz as wave files, 24-bit. I can then just hit add to render queue. Oh, there's before I forget, you can delay a queued render. So we'd say if you've got something like Superior Drummer or Stephen Slate Drums or something like Contact, anything that's sample based, you can set a number of seconds to give that some leeway to load them all up before it tries to render that project, so that it doesn't have half a song with missing samples, because that's something that used to happen with this. It was great except if you needed to load files up and you'd be missing kick drums and things. So that then gives it loading time, waits as long as you define it to. So let's say 30 seconds. Yes, we know those exist. And that's not started rendering them. So if we go to open render queue, there is our render. So we've got, that's the project name, that's the format that they're going to be, and that's the files, the master plus wave plus 17 that they're going to be. So if I was to open another project and add that to the queue, I could do that all day long. So I could add 10 renders to this queue, and then I just hit render all, or I could select a few and hit render selected. So then that will load up each project, render it out. Even if you were doing this with, say, online bouncing, so you had 10 projects, you were routing them all through a hardware compressor or something, again, you'd have to sit through it all, wouldn't you? Not so. So if you set every track that you've got with all your hardware on your online bounces and then put them in this queue, it would then open the file, wait as long as you want to load your samples, play it through all the hardware, make the export files, close it down, load the next one up, and go and go and go and go. So then if you've got an hour-long album that's all needs online bouncing, you can save yourself an hour of your own time, where you can either just be listening while you work on something else and let it go on, or you can be in another room entirely and just check the mixes when they're done, if that's your way. The other thing you can do is, because you're not just limited to using different projects, I could put the same project in here, different sample rates, different file formats. This is something I very often do when I'm doing mastering. At the very, very final stage, when I'm happy that everything's done, I can then add in, generally I know you'd only use master mixes for mastering, but let's say the whole project was at 96 kilohertz. Yeah. So I could export 96k 24-bit, add that to the queue. I could also do a version for YouTube, which would be 48k 24-bit, add that to the queue. I could do a 44.1k 16-bit and make sure there's dither appropriately with the noise shaping, and then add that. I could add an MP3 version just to send to the band to have a listen, or to go upload to sites that take ready-made MP3s. Or instead of just hitting yes, 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 I could then make a mastering version that's got, the relevant settings for the right outputs, I can just add them all to the queue. And then when I'm ready, I just open the render queue and I hit render all, and that could take ages, and that's done. And I come back and hey. So what I quite often do when I'm at the studio is I have two computers in the live room, or in the control room, and I'll have one exporting whilst I then can carry on continuing recording on the other one, which means that I've got absolutely no downtime because I'm not just going, oh sorry, the studio computer's busy. So that means that I can then get on with doing multiple things and not have to consistently monitor both machines. I mean, yes, you need to check your mixes at the end, but that's no different from before. You always should check your mixes. It's just in this case, I'll then have as many files to check in one go as I've rendered, and that block of time I have saved myself. So hopefully this has saved you tons of time, because over the years as Reaper's developed, these features have saved me tons and tons of time, and I can be talking to artists while we render out every track from a master, and it can just stop you from having to be there attending to the machine like a child all the time. It can really free you up. So hopefully this has done that for you. Hit the like button if you found any of this useful, and please subscribe to the channel because we really appreciate it. Check out our Patreon page, because the Patreon is a way to support us to do what we do. If you can give us something on Patreon, we can give back to you by giving you early access to videos, direct contact with me to ask questions that guaranteed that I'll see them and get to them. And also, if you want to send us anything to play with as a gear review or anything like that, just let us know, because we're starting to do more and more of that kind of thing. Hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching. I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios, and I'll see you in the next video.